Good afternoon. Welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at an amendment to H 941, an act relating to municipal regulation of agriculture starting off with our legislative counselors who have been working on this issue. Welcome.
Morning, Bradley Shulman, Office of Legislative Counsel.
Good afternoon. Ellen Tchaikovsky.
I am from the past. That's why I said good morning. Today we'll be talking about the a draft amendment to the House Municipal Regulation of Agriculture Bill, House Bill number 941. So this bill purports to prohibit municipalities from regulating farming activity primarily speaking, if two criteria are met.
And actually, can I just interrupt for a second just to level set and how we got here? I actually asked Legislative Council to try their very best to draft something that would actually address the court case that causes us all to be here, which has been affectionately known as duckweed. So that's where this comes from, this draft bill. So, excuse me, go ahead.
Thank you. And in drafting this bill, the issue in the Taft Street decision was that a farming activity on a 0.51 acre parcel in Essex was farming in a way that the city didn't want, but was subject to the required agricultural practices. So they're regulated by the Agency of Agriculture instead. So the city had trouble regulating that activity until they went to the Supreme Court. So what this bill does is tries to manage the potentially unintended consequences of the Taft Street Supreme Court decision, while also giving municipalities some way to regulate activity with certain restrictions. So here are those restrictions. So this bill amends section 4413. A bylaw under this chapter shall not regulate farming that, and there's two criteria. The first criteria is what we're familiar with in this statute. It meets the minimum threshold criteria of the required agricultural practices rule and is therefore required to comply with the required agricultural practices rule, and takes place on a parcel of land that is 1 acre or larger. So what this would have the effect is, if you have a parcel of land in a municipality, there's other exceptions that we'll go over in a moment that are later on. But what this has the effect of is, if you have a parcel of land of less than 1 acre in a municipality may regulate that acreage by bylaw, even if it is subject to the required agricultural practices. So that is the change from our understanding of current law. And that would, in this instance, would give a municipality like the city of Essex the ability to regulate farming activity that was taking place on a parcel of land that is 0.51 acres.
Half acre.
Half an acre.
It was half an acre. Yeah.
More words, the better.
By the word.
I'm sorry. This
Friday afternoon humor.
We've all had a long week. So this bill also prohibits municipality from constructing a farm from regulating the construction of a farm structure as defined in the required agricultural practices rule. It does not touch the accepted silvicultural practices section. We're on to the next page. It does not touch the exemption for forestry operations, and it adds 2 additional exemptions. So municipalities may not regulate by bylaw the cultivation or use or other use of land for growing plants for food, for personal use, donation, or sale, including orchard crops, viticultural crops, and maple sap, and for maple sap. Or this also prohibits municipalities from regulating the raising, feeding, or management of a poultry flock of not more than 15 birds, excluding roosters, for personal use, donation, or sale. And so those are all of the kind of restrictions on what a municipality may not regulate. Things that don't fit into these enumerated restrictions, a municipality may regulate by bylaw. There's some additional definitions as we move down. We've clarified the definition of farm structure to unify it with the required agricultural practices rule. The definition of farm structure that's in statute is approximately similar to the definition of farm structure that is in the required agricultural practices rule. The statute refers to the required agricultural practices rule when identifying what a farm structure is. So we thought unifying those definitions would be a good idea to create consistency in our framework. I will note, and this is in current statute as well as in required agricultural practices and in this bill as well, but a farm structure is not a dwelling for human habitation. So we're not talking about on-farm housing for farm workers. So that is excluded from this exemption. Municipality may regulate that by bylaw. We've added definitions of farming. We actually didn't add the definition of farming. We just pulled it out and made it clear that farming is the same meaning as 10 VSA 6001-22. Food means articles or agricultural commodities for human or animal consumption. Poultry has the same meaning as 6 VSA 1459-4. And then this amendment, the second piece of this amendment is it strikes out the provisions in the original bill, or not the original, or the bill as passed, as introduced in 4412. If you recall that section, but that was the section where it said it gave certain conditions about what a municipality can and cannot regulate. This bill, instead of kind of trying to design that by statute, it just puts the restrictions on municipalities and kind of limits what the restrictions on municipalities, what municipalities may not regulate, and puts that in there. And then in that realm that we've left over for municipalities to regulate, they can regulate as they see fit.
Does this omit the tier 1A?
This omits the tier 1A, so we're not referring to the tier structure anymore in this bill.
Questions?
And actually, Ellen, do you have anything that you'd like to add before we ask questions?
No, I think reading all of the four prongs together, you see what municipalities are not allowed to regulate and what they are allowed to regulate. So there is this acreage threshold that's been added, but there are also protections added for the growing of food that isn't farming, as well as your backyard flocks of chickens or other poultry.
Representative Tagliavia.
This is going to include livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, things like that. They're not expressly included here, correct?
So right. So under the definition of farming, there are specific triggers related to the raising of livestock. If someone has livestock that meets that definition and is on more than 1 acre of land, the municipality cannot regulate them. They're being regulated by the RAPs. If they're not, municipality does have the ability to have some regulation, with the exception of poultry.
Representative North and then Austin.
You have a question on a sentence that exempts the chicken or
And I just wanted to add the definition, by the way, in 6,000 and 6 VSA 1459 is definition of poultry is any domesticated bird. So it's more than just chicken.
Yeah.
So sorry, I said that a minute ago.
H2, so.
okay. Oh, I'm on the wrong. Amendment, not the original. Okay, yeah. So just at that sentence, the raising, feeding, or management of poultry flock, not more than 15 birds, comma, excluding roosters, comma. Does the excluding roosters apply to the number of birds, the 15 birds, or to the poultry flock? In other words, are you allowed to have roosters in your poultry flock? Or do you just not count the roosters as you're counting up 15 birds?
The lead-in language on this sentence is what the town is not allowed to regulate. So they're not allowed to regulate a flock of not more than 15 birds. So under that, they can't regulate that, but that excludes roosters, meaning that the town can regulate roosters.
Okay, so the excluding roosters applies to the poultry flock, not to the number of birds.
No, to what towns can regulate. Towns can, it's intended, excuse me,
Yeah, no, you were right.
intended to be that the town can regulate roosters.
Can regulate roosters.
Yeah.
That's.
Maybe clarification.
So, which would it? I guess it could be more clear if it was up on on line 7 instead. So the raising of a poultry flock excluding roosters of not more than 15.
That would make it clear to me, because when I read it, I was just like, oh, you can count the birds, you can have 14 roosters and 1 chicken, and that counts as 15 birds.
Yeah. Yes, I hear. I hear.
Farm of 15 roosters. is what- Good people.
Oh, my God.
That's why I asked. And then my other question was also, so
Yeah.
the very last couple of sentences of the amendment on page 3, lines 2 and 3, striking out section 3, that's section 3 of the original bill. So the entirety of section 3 is struck. And there was quite a bit in there, striking out all. Okay.
Representative Austin.
Just the 1 acre, is there any limit to livestock on 1 acre?
Go ahead.
I can answer that. So you mean on 1 acre or more? So that would be,
On 1 acre, can you have like 5 cows on 1 acre? I don't know what the wraps.
So,
are.
yeah.
And I'm in Colchester, so I'm thinking, neighbors, neighborhood, then an acre with 5 or 10
There's-
cows or whatever.
and that's a good question. And so the required agricultural practices regulates farming activity, and it sets certain criteria for reaching that farming activity. And that activity,
In the rule, there is a list of how many per type of livestock would trigger the wrap rule.
but that provision has you have to be raising that livestock on more than 4 acres. And so, what I wanted to just pull up really quick, because I have it here, is there is without amending the RAPs, without amending the required agricultural practices, the Agency of Agriculture doesn't necessarily have an easy way to regulate farming activity that is between 1 and 4 acres. So some of the regulations that they proposed in changing, or some of the changes in the RAPs that they proposed in the Senate version of this, would give them more authority to regulate the raising, feeding, and management of livestock on between 1 and 4 acres. What's currently in the RAPs, though, is, I believe, a provision that if the livestock is causing a problem, with better wording, other livestock types, combinations, or numbers is designated by the Secretary of Agriculture based upon or resulting from the impacts of water quality consistent with this rule, that would still require 4 acres. No, that would not require 4 acres. Okay. So the Agency of Agriculture just confirmed that if that livestock, so under current RAPS rules, if the Secretary of Agriculture determined that livestock is causing a problem to water quality, which is what the RAPs are really about,
Mhm.
then the Agency of Agriculture could step in and regulate that farming activity. But as the RAPs as they currently are, it mainly focuses on the income that you're generating from farming to become regulated, or the land mass that you're using.
And under this amendment, if they're not regulated by the RAPs, these livestock, the municipality would have some authority to regulate that.
Yeah, and that's exactly right.
Yep.
So if there is, if they are not subject to the RAPs and they are between 1 and 4 acres, the municipality is free to regulate that activity. But if they were then to become subject to the required agricultural activities, then that would change.
So can the municipality limit the number of livestock, let's say on 1 acre?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Chad, we do.
Do we have any idea how many small operations, farms, what you call, are operating currently in Vermont that are not in some sort of litigation or conflict with their neighbors, or their municipality in the state, that this is going to affect because they're smaller than an acre, but larger than a half acre?
I think maybe some of the witnesses, other witnesses could answer that.
I don't believe we have data on the number of farms that are less than 1 acre. And the Secretary of Agriculture could certainly speak to that a little bit more, but they're not regulated, but oftentimes are not regulated by the Agency of Agriculture. So it's hard to get a count.
Any other questions for legislative council? I need you to say again, Bradley, what you just said about the the towns could regulate up to 4 acres. Where is that?
Okay. So, and that's a good question because this bill incorporates provisions of the required agricultural practices rule. Excuse me. And so if you have farming activity that is not subject to the required agricultural practices rule, a town is free to regulate that farming activity. And so this bill sets 2 criteria to prohibit a municipality from regulating farming activity, being subject to the required agricultural practices rule and being on a parcel that is 1 acre or larger. And so if you are farming activity that is not subject to the required agricultural practices rule, then a municipality could be free to regulate you. And so I can give you an example. So if you had a 5-acre plot of land and you had 2 cows on that plot of land that was not causing a problem with water, and you were not making any money off of that land, I don't see a way that you would be subject to the required agricultural practice. Because you don't reach the threshold criteria in that rule of a certain number of animals on a certain acreage, or tilling, growing crops on a certain amount of acreage, or making a certain amount of farm income, or filing a 1040-F with your federal tax returns about claiming farm income. Those would be ways that you would get to be subject to the required agricultural practices rule. And that is now half of what this bill or what the requirement is to be exempt from municipal regulation.
And then therefore you're saying the town could regulate it.
The town could regulate it if they're not subject to the required agricultural practices rule. And that's actually the law now. I mean, I take that back because the Supreme Court has changed our understanding of the law. So I would say pre-Taft Street, pre-Duckweed case, that would be our understanding of what the law was, is that towns are free to regulate activity that is not subject to the required agricultural practices.
Thank you.
More questions for us?
There will be, so I hope you can
Let's stay
stay.
around. Yeah, for sure.
We have one right now. Representative Chapin.
Thanks. Yeah, I just love to clarify my understanding that this change would mean that this bill would allow zoning, sort of unfettered zoning regulation on much of homesteading where people have either more than 15 birds, need to have male birds, other livestock, as long as they're under the $2,000 income and don't otherwise trigger the reps.
I missed what was the intro to your question?
My understanding is that much of homesteading, but when I think of homesteading, I think of beyond just growing some vegetables and up to 15 chickens. I think of, potentially growing other livestock, dairy, probably more than 15 chickens, maybe some male chickens if I'm raising my own, creating my own eggs. But if I'm under the income threshold and I don't otherwise trigger the RAPs, I'd be subject to any kind of zoning in any town.
There is the provision that towns cannot regulate cultivation of food.
So my garden might not be, but any livestock that's beyond that 15 hens or 15 female birds.
And if I may,
Yeah.
I think the important thing to point out is that if you are not subject to the required agricultural practices rules, so you don't have the requisite number of land mass, the number of animals, you're not causing a problem with water quality, and you're not making farm income. So if you're not already subject to the required agricultural practices rule, that is the law today. And so municipalities are free to regulate farming activity that's not subject to the required agricultural practices rule. And actually, just to make it complicated, the law today, because of the Supreme Court case, is that municipalities can regulate you regardless whether you're subject to the required agricultural practices rule.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about the fact that much of that homesteading already sort of falls outside of the exemptions.
And this is the municipal zoning chapter, so a town has to adopt zoning in order for them to use these regulations.
Thank you.
Further questions for legislative council? No, thank you.
Thank you.
You can stay with us though.
Yeah, we will.
Thank you. All right, Steve Collier.
Is it morning or afternoon? Are we
Hmm.
Oh,
Welcome back.
yeah, good afternoon. You want me to start or? Yeah, Steve Collier from the Agency of Agriculture. So again, really appreciate all of your efforts on this issue. You know, we, as I think I told you before, we reached an agreement with the League of Cities and Towns to propose a certain standard, and they agreed that they would do the same. And we're sticking to that standard until we can come to a different consensus. And we did that just because we felt it was very important to restore the exemption. So officially, we're not changing our stance on that, but as we also said, we really want the language to get across the finish line because it's really important to address this. And from our perspective, the amendment that you're proposing is much closer to what we proposed initially. The real difference in what we proposed initially was that someone who has livestock needs at least an acre of land. And then we also built in the growing food protections and the protection for the small, we called it a small backyard poultry flock. So this language that you're proposing goes much closer to what we propose. So that's, from our perspective, is obviously beneficial. The one pretty important difference, though, that I see is that what this language proposes is that 1 acre would apply to all farms, not just to livestock. That's a pretty big difference from our perspective, because we really think livestock is where it's important to have enough land base to manage your nutrients and your waste. And so there's two pieces to that. One is that right now, this language would create a disconnect between the accessory on-farm business and farming, because the way that accessory on-farm businesses are defined is that they are subject to the RAPs. So this would create a statutory addition to the RAP. So right now with this language, technically you could be an accessory on-farm business, but not be exempt from zoning. So I don't think anybody wants that disconnect. And so what we would propose, if you're thinking about aligning everything, is on your new language where you say 1 acre, be clear that that 1 acre pertains to raising or managing or feeding livestock. And then amending the definition of accessory on-farm business to be clear that you have to be subject to the required agricultural practices and be exempt from municipal zoning. So those two things would make it, so I think it would be to not have the synchronicity between farming, zoning, and accessory on-farm business, I think would really put some folks in a bind trying to figure out how to interpret that. I drafted some language really quickly. If you want to see it, I brought some copies, but it would, and it's not in your fancy numbered letterhead because I don't want it to look like it comes from legislative council, but that's it. Thanks.
The copy for me.
I do in that stack. There's, yeah.
Go this way. There we.
Yeah, that's all right. You'll-
That's fine. So I'm sorry it's not lined, but there's really only three changes. The first one is in the middle of page 1 where you see D1 A2. It starts provided that any activity.
Yeah.
Right in the middle of the page. So that would amend the current language that you have about 1 acre, saying provided that any activity involving the raising, feeding, or management of livestock. And this next bit is unwieldy, as livestock is defined in the required agricultural practices rule, just because I didn't want to add the definition of livestock below because I was in a hurry. But it really probably would be better to also define livestock. But it's important because livestock in the RAPs includes birds. So it's because of the differentiation of poultry, I think it's important that it's clear that livestock also includes poultry in this context. So there, I think the cleaner way to do it would just be to define livestock below, but I just threw it in here quickly like this. But essentially that would do what you're thinking about doing, is requiring the 1 acre parcel, but it would limit that to livestock. And the other reason I think that's important is that farms are not just one parcel, they're usually many parcels. And so a farm may be, it could be, especially I'm thinking small produce operations, they might have 4 3/4 acre parcels. And they might actually grow a lot of produce on that. And that might be all the land that somebody who's starting can afford to do. If those are all of those could be, all of those parcels together can be a farm. But if you have the 1 acre requirement, then those people might not be farming, even though they're having the sales, and even though they have an accessory on-farm business. Or a farm might have 10 acres and then a separate, 3/4 acre parcel. And if you have this 1 acre parcel requirement without limiting it to livestock, you might be saying that 3/4 acre parcel, which actually happens to be just perfect for a farm stand because it's on a busy road, and with an accessory on farm business, you could not only sell your own products, but other farms' products. You might be taking that out of the farm analysis. So I think it's another reason to consider limiting it to livestock alone. But the other changes are on the bottom of page 3. And this is moving into the accessory on, so in section 441211 is where you define accessory on farm business. And near the bottom of the page, there's a definition of farm under II2. And in the middle of that, the underline is very light. I'm sorry about that. But in the middle of that, it says, and exempt from municipal zoning pursuant to section 4413 D1A of this chapter. So that would just mean that if a farm is going to be able to be an accessory on farm business, it would need to both meet the RAP rules and be exempt from zoning, which would tie back to your 1 acre requirement. Does that make sense? Is that just trying to align the definitions? Because I think they should be aligned, whatever you decide to do. And then the same change is made at the bottom of page 4 under B2, where it starts the farm meets the threshold criteria. And again, there's light underline at the end of that sentence where it says, and is exempt from municipal zoning pursuant to that same section. So there are other tweaks that I might suggest, but at this late in I think this is the more important issue to focus on right now. And we do expect the Senate version, which is more along the lines of what we proposed with the 1 acre for livestock. We think that you'll be also getting that in the second half of the session. So there's certainly more time, we believe, to be discussing these issues, but that was sort of our immediate feedback. From our perspective, this is moving in a good direction. We don't think it should be tied to tier 1, although we understand why the league thinks it should, but we want all farms to be treated the same throughout the state. But we also recognize that when you're raising livestock, you need sufficient land to be able to do that.
Thank you. Members have questions? Representative Austin?
Just to clarify, because I'm not familiar with the RAPs that much, I'm assuming that there's a ratio between how much livestock you can have on 1 acre.
That's a great question. And there is, the way that farm is defined under the RAPs is you either have to have 4 contiguous acres. That means you could have separate parcels too, but you need at least one parcel that's 4 contiguous acres with a specified number of animals. So that's one way, regardless of whether you're commercially farming. If you have 4 horses on 5 acres, you're a farm. And that's there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's how it's defined. However, if you are commercially farming on less than 4 acres or on more than 4 acres without that number of animals, you can also be a farm. And commercially farming means you've got $2,000 on average in product sales, or you're filing a Schedule F. So that's why there is no, currently under the current law, there's no minimum acreage requirement if you are commercially farming. If it's just about the animals and the numbers, that's already there. But if you're selling products, that's how the ducks fell into this. You call them duckweed, I call them the dopey ducks. So they fell into this because they were on a half an acre. And it was, from our perspective, they should have fallen under it. And the Supreme Court misunderstood the rules, but we're here because of that issue.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Someone's in the dentist office.
Mhm.
Sorry. Samantha Sheehan.
Josh is gonna join you, if that's okay.
Who's that?
Tree, oh, they were working their way up. What? Oh.
For the record, Josh Sanford, Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
And Samantha Sheehan, also with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
Here to, thanks for inviting us in to talk about this amendment. I think you'll probably understand our position hasn't changed and we don't support this amendment. And we'd like to show you why and talk about what some of the questions you were just asking and in the big picture, why we don't think RAPs are the right way to regulate, to try to incorporate land use zoning in municipalities because of the varying answers of yes or no you get and current circumstances and situations in the state that are not being addressed by the RAPs as a way to manage farms and the conflicts that currently exist beyond the Taft's Corner 1 acre scenario. We do agree that this 1 acre would solve the Taft Corners problem, but there's other problems and the RAPs aren't the right way to address this.
And again, our goal is to protect the right to farm and make sure that there's an ability for farms to exist everywhere, but that where they exist in close proximity to other properties, other residences, other types of commercial uses, that there be a reasonable amount of regulation that prevents the type of conflicts that brought the Taft case to the Supreme Court, but that causes other types of environmental justice and neighborly and impacts on other neighboring properties. So as we testified was that last week that we were? No, I have no idea. The last time you saw us, as we testified to, we propose allowing municipalities to regulate farms in Act 250 exempt areas. So after the state makes an area of a municipality Act 250 exempt, then municipal zoning could apply. And we oppose or were unable, after a lot of meeting and conversation and negotiation, are unable to support using the RAPs as a threshold to determine municipal zoning authority, primarily because it does not consider, the RAPs were not made to regulate some of the issues that are important to us and to our municipal members, such as setbacks, fencing, penting, parking, ingress and egress of traffic and vehicles in and out of a farm and onto municipal roads, screening, lighting, and other common zoning issues and common points of conflict between incompatible land uses that are next door to each other. By referring to the RAPs as the definition for commercial farm and using that as the trigger point for whether or not a municipality may regulate, a property means that a property owner could be doing any agricultural activity. And if they make $2,000 in sales, not income, $2,000 in sales per year, then they could be regulated. Or they could not be regulated by the municipality. They would qualify for the RAPs. And they could also make no sales in a year. And if they file a Schedule F, they would be a commercial farm subject to the RAPs and exempt from any municipal regulation. And then lastly, the agency, you know, we agree that it has been the common understanding and the common interpretation of municipal zoning administrators that prior to the Taft decision, if you were doing agricultural activity that was subject to the RAPs, the municipality could not regulate you. You did not need a permit for a farm structure. You were not required to follow municipal land or municipal animal ordinance that applied to non-farm properties. And those were not enforced by the municipality. And we know that in these situations in particular where you have either and small acreage and a high stock of livestock, the agency has failed to address really serious issues because of the limitations of the RAPs. And we have an example to talk about shortly. But Representative Austin asked, I think, a really important question. I want to be really clear about what the amendment you're considering would do. And part of this confusion and sort of lack of clarity or the ability of a property owner to move in or out of the RAPs in 1 year to the next year is another reason I could have added that on the previous slide. That's another reason we don't think the way to determine whether or not municipal regulation applies or is exempt is through the RAPs, because so you asked if someone had 5 cows on 1 acre in Colchester, could the town of Colchester regulate them? With this amendment, the answer is no, because it's 1 acre or larger, then they would be exempt from zoning. However, if they had 4 cows on the same property, then the answer is yes. Because 5 cows is the trigger for the RAPs, and 1 acre is in the amendment. If they had 4 cows on 100 acres, which I think would be a great place to have 4 cows, then the municipality could regulate them. If they had 1 cow on 1 acre and made 200 in sales, 2,000 in sales annually, no. 1 cow on 1 acre with no income at all, but they filed the Schedule F, then the answer is no, the municipality cannot regulate them. They would qualify to be regulated by the required agricultural practices. And before the Taft decision, this was basically true, but the acreage threshold was different. So that's what you're changing. You're actually lowering the acreage threshold. So this amendment would do 2 things. It would create a right to grow food and to have 15 hens, but not roosters, which we support. We totally support the right to grow food for everyone, whether you're selling or sharing or trading or just enjoying the food that you grow at home. And it would generally diminish the regulatory authority that municipalities had prior to the Taft decision by lowering the acreage to 1. So these are the reasons we prefer the approach we testified to previously, which is to allow municipal authority that is limited and appropriate, does not ban farming, and only applies in Act 250 exempt areas where other types of land uses are also Act 250 exempt. And Josh is gonna sort of talk about a situation we have right now where local zoning is being enforced. This would get thrown out if this law passed.
If this amendment passed and this law passed as it's being put forward in both bodies, really would undo this court case that's happening right now, because the RAPs haven't been able to regulate this. It's a 4.7 acre farm with hundreds of pigs right in the village. It's been over the news for years. There's been lots of concerns and allegations. It's surrounded by elderly senior housing, other municipal buildings. And it's a pretty contentious case going on right now. And finally, since the Supreme Court case, the town is undertaking zoning violations and trying to bring justice to the surrounding neighbors who have been demanding it for years. Also, it's in the middle of the village. This is before Tier 1B is approved. This is currently exempt from Act 250 under interim rules up to 75 units of housing. It has water, it has sewer, the village has its own electric department. And this is right in the dead center of it. And we really think that these are the type of situations, the only type of situations, the only locations in Vermont, less than 2% of the area, that we want any authority to do this. And we want the authority to do this because there's people living closely and someone needs to manage that conflict. Without Act 250 rules in place, it's really important. This is right along the banks of the Willoughby and Barton River. It's next to the school. It's next to the a major employer. And as I said, affordable senior and family housing. And it's finally being resolved by the zoning administrator. This farm has not violated any RAPs. My understanding is it's been visited a couple times because the RAPs weren't designed to do what municipalities do with land use regulation and the competing interests and conflict.
Yeah, so as Josh said, the red area is currently Act 250 exempt. It also generally reflects what would be eligible for 1B exemption in the village of Orleans, which is inside the municipality of Barton. And the blue splotch you can see there is the 4.47 acre, mostly pig farm that is in question. So we don't just want to tell you what we oppose in your language. We want to tell you what we support, which is a right to grow food for all property owners. So plants and fowl, some number of fowl. Preventing any municipal ban on farming anywhere, even in Tier 1A and Tier 1B. We think that farming should be an allowed use of land in every situation, although in 1A and 1B, which is projected to be 2% of the state land area, that some municipal regulation would apply. And we support outside of Tier 1A and Tier 1B and 98% of the land area, including in at least 109 municipalities that have not adopted zoning or subdivision bylaw, that all farming be totally exempt from municipal regulation. So that's what we're asking for, as a solution to deal with conflicts like we see in the Taft case and in Barton. There's others that have been in the news in Windham County and Charlotte was a goat farm, I think. Anyway, these are conflicts that have happened for a long time in Vermont communities, and that we would like to prevent in the future as we make these areas even more dense and more dynamic through other land use decisions that really the state has decided. The state chose in Act 181 to require the village Orleans to upzone quite dramatically in the Home Act. And then in Act 181 made that same area Act 250 exempt. And there happened to be this problematic farm right in the center of that. This is an example of a Tier 1A map that we can see from Rutland. Rutland was the first RPC to complete their Act 181 planning process that uses the future land use areas defined in state law and applies them to the regional plan. So this map is currently before the LURB for approval. We expect Pittsburgh to be eligible for Tier 1B and to request Tier 1B. So you can see it's a pretty, if I remember correctly, I think Pittsburgh is 40 square miles. It's a really large municipality. That purple splotch is where the State Police Academy is located, if you've ever been there. And then the pink, like kind of square donut. If I move my mouse, you can see it, right? So this is the area that would be tier 1B eligible. So you can see sort of in the context, they have permanent zoning and bylaw, they have municipal water and sewer. They have a plan for growth in this area. And it's suited for more density and for more housing. And again, generally, this area currently is Act 250 exempt. And by another set of state preemptions in state law against municipal zoning is already zoned, and you are allowed to build 20 units per acre of housing here. I feel like I had one more thing from your discussion to address, but, oh, I did. So another reason we're really not satisfied with using 1 acre to determine whether or not the municipal regulation applies, or it would really be, 0.99 acres, right? Then municipal zoning and regulation can apply, is because when we are talking about livestock and not plants, it doesn't say what shape the 1 acre is. It could be an isosceles triangle. It could be what they call a dog-ear lot that has a really narrow frontage, goes back and then gets wide. Those are really common types of subdivisions that we see in these old downtown areas. It could be 1 acre, oddly shaped, that has multiple structures or units of housing on it and very little green space or area to manage the livestock in a reasonable way. So these are the type of considerations that municipal regulation does understand, consider, and use in its decision-making about how far a setback should be. There are downtowns in Vermont where you can build to the drip edge, right? Like your property line and your setback is the drip edge. Could you or should you be farming with less than 20 or 15 feet between structures? So this is the type of detail as well as nuance that can be considered in municipal regulation and can be applied by the appropriate municipal body that is just not considered in the RAPs. And 1 acre is a pretty small area. If it's oddly shaped, if the soil is poor, and if it has a number of large existing structures already on it.
Thanks for your testimony. I guess I need you to walk me through how the limited criteria or things you could regulate under the as passed, the House Ag Committee is going to address the conflicts that have come up.
Sure. Well, if you remember, we actually want to use the language in 4413, which is slightly different, not the language in the as passed, which is, if I remember correctly, it was traffic, egress and ingress, striping, parking, fire code, and something else that I'm forgetting.
Fencing.
Oh, right. Fencing of livestock that is adjacent to a road. So that's what's in the as passed. The 4413 framework is the one that we prefer, and it is broader, but it's also tested by the courts as well as by many years, many decades of real application at the municipal level. And so that would have been a longer list that would include siting, setback, lighting, screening, yards, parking, traffic, signage, and some other things that I'm forgetting. So we prefer the 4413 language. This is what's used right now for hospitals, for solid waste. So transfer stations, dumps. So you can't prevent, a municipality cannot prevent a
Emergency shelter.
Yeah, emergency
school.
shelters, churches, hospitals. So in the case of, if you think of wherever you go to drop off your trash and your recycling, the municipality cannot prevent the use of the property for that purpose, but they can require screening from the road, so that when you drive by, you're not looking at, piles of refrigerators and dumpsters full of couches or whatever happens to be there. So that's the solution that we prefer. The language in the as passed is much closer to what we've been asking for, and it would help with some of those issues. So in the case of the Village of Orleans, they could require fencing.
Except they
yeah.
can't because it's restricted to tier 1A. So,
Right.
Our original language was all of tier 1. Tier 1B is still quite restrictive. As Representative Sakowicz and I witnessed at our planning commission and select board meeting just 2 nights ago, where we were reviewing the area with the RPC and looking at where had sewer and water and sidewalks. That's where you can have 1B eligibility.
Sorry, though, I just really want to go back to how would these limited items address the Barton issue or the Essex issue? How would that give the
I would,
towns the tools they need?
yeah, I mean,
Fencing and setback in both of those would have gone a really long way. If the municipality could require, so if the property owner involved in the situation in Essex had the same number of ducks and was cultivating less cannabis as just a private property owner, like as a homesteader, not as a commercial enterprise, then the municipality could have required fencing and setbacks, just as they do for other property owners in that same residential zoning district.
You still would have had sound and smell and everything else that went.
it's being regulated to the extent they can, like other property owners in close proximity that have conflicts. It would still guarantee the right to farm. It would just try to manage it where the wraps aren't designed to do that.
Which is true in dozens and dozens of municipalities for hundreds of Vermonters and has been for centuries. Like everywhere, wherever Vermonters have ever lived, they have lived there with animals. And prior to the wraps, the municipalities regulated those whether or not it was a commercial enterprise. So right now, in most Vermont municipalities, you may have livestock. You may have them as pets. You may have them to cultivate for food. And the municipality may require certain conditions. They may require a permit or not. And there may be conditions on that permit that say, if you have, so for example, the city of Burlington, you're allowed to have chickens, but you have to secure them at night. And a secure coop means also from predators and at-large dogs. So if you have a coop and that coop is secure and the chickens are inside of it at night, you're allowed to have chickens in the city of Burlington, and many people do.
Representative Chapin.
Appreciate all the explanation. I really have a lot of shared concerns around some of these really problem sites. I'm not sure I agree on the solution, but so I have a couple questions. One of my biggest concerns, having worked with farm businesses on profitability and viability for 15 years across the state, highly aware of how difficult it is to make a living farming. I want to offer you a correction on your slide that talks about income. You said that you could have no income because your expenses are more than your sales, and that's not true. The word income doesn't mean net income. And even a negative net income is still income. And many of our even largest farms in the state could be making $1.5 million in sales on their milk and have 1.6 million in expenses. That is a very common occurrence. And I just want to be respectful of farm businesses of all kinds of scales in commercial farming, but negative profits is a regular occurrence in this sector. So on that note, I would just ask, I understand the concept that we could have, like, the zoning can't put you out of farming, but like, how do you manage that when requiring a certain kind of fencing or setback could turn that commercial operation from net positive to net negative? What are going to be the parameters in place around zoning that would protect against that?
I think that's a great point. Later on in the bill, there's a report that's called for to come up with model zoning. I think many of the farm groups, we'd agree, to have one standard model zoning ordinance would be really great. But that's what we should be doing this summer. I mean, the reality is the Supreme Court case is almost 10 months old. The Barton case is the only municipality that's adopted zoning to try to correct the problem. The sky's not falling. Municipalities don't want to jump and regulate farming. We should pause and get this right and do just that with input. and create a set of farming and zoning standards that look at this and treat everyone fairly. Again, we're only wanting this to apply in the most dense areas of Vermont where there's water and sewer and sidewalks.
I love that. And personally, I'd love to see us focus on this working group as bringing everyone to the table and really studying these challenging situations and figuring out how to address this at the municipal level. I think I'd really welcome that conversation. I'm really nervous about putting a lot of what's in the amendment or in the bill into practice yet. I'd be a lot more comfortable focusing on pulling all the right stakeholders together and having a deep conversation about that.
The underlying bill does have a study, that is in there as passed, yes. And we wholeheartedly support it. And I'll just remind you again from our testimony, which is posted and you can refer back to, but we would propose 2 changes to that. One is to go farther and to actually also explore ways that municipal zoning and bylaw and planning, probably most importantly, could seek to protect and promote agricultural land uses, not just regulate. And also, I think it's really important that in the stakeholder organizations, there be included citizen planners, as well as planners that work for a municipality or RPC, and zoning administrators who are really the frontline government official that has these conversations with farmers and homeowners and neighbors, either seeking to undertake an agricultural practice on their property or who have found a conflict with something happening with a neighbor. So,
And to further, that thought, Representative, our approach to trying to deal with that imbalance of how hard it is to make a living farming, but yet we support it. Municipalities, Vermonters value it. The path so far of just saying, well, we're going to help you by not regulating you as much doesn't seem to be stopping the bleeding. Like maybe we need to regulate in a way through this working group in zoning that areas that do have prime ag soils that are zoned rural agricultural, maybe they get actually incentives, not just less regulations, because the regulations don't seem to be bringing the success since municipal zoning hasn't been allowed until 10 months ago, creating these situations you talked about. So there really should be a bigger picture to look at the whole challenge and the whole solution and balance the municipal concerns in some very dense areas with the real concerns that farming is highly valued in Vermont and needs to stay and needs more support. And maybe land use planning could also support that, not just regulate.
Thank you.
sorry, if I could just say one more thing. In either the language in the bill as passed or in our preferred framework, which would use the 4413 protection, I want to like give you an example of like what would not apply, because I understand the concern about the regulatory cost or expense on the farm as a commercial enterprise, and the type of regulation that would be allowed, again, in either framework, the one that was worked on by the House Agriculture Committee, or if you use the current list that applies to churches and homeless shelters, it doesn't allow the municipality to regulate things like the materials of a building or siding. Like I have a board and batten exterior on my home, which I really like. And it's really, it is on my house because it was really expensive for the person who put it there. And in municipal regulation, oftentimes board and batten siding is not allowed. You have to shingle. So that's just like an example of a type of municipal regulation that would apply to a commercial business that's non-farm or to a residential use, but the farm in the same area would be exempted from, because it would just be limited to that, like siding, setbacks, fencing, parking, lighting, screening, et cetera. That like 14-ish types of zoning issues that are listed there.
Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Oh, Steve Collier?
Yeah, thanks. If I could just add a quick clarifying point, just so in case everyone doesn't know, every municipality already can regulate animals that escape the farm. Towns have that authority. They've always had that authority. They continue to have that authority. 2 years ago, the legislature actually increased the penalties for that. So to the extent that we're talking about animals escaping, like from Orleans, towns have the authority to do that. Neighbors can also sue for violations, but towns can issue fines for escaped animals because it's a public safety issue. It's not farming, it's public safety. They can issue fines, they can seize animals. So there's nothing about this zoning discussion. I think they should get conflated with animals that are running loose, because animals that are running loose, we agree, are absolutely within the town's authority. Thank you.
Graham?
My name is Graham Unang Strufenoff. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont. May I use this chair?
Yes, sir.
This is my daughter Juniper Batten Unang Strufenoff. You're welcome to sit there. This is a in-service day. She is joining me as we were not expecting to be called into my testimony, but thank you for inviting and making this welcome. And thank you for your patience. Good to see you all. So I speak for Rural Vermont. I think Caroline has been here, so you're familiar with our organization and she's introduced us. I also speak for the larger coalition of agricultural organizations, which has been working in alignment on this issue for many months. I think given we haven't been in this committee much, I want to start from the beginning and state for the record our coalitions and what we believe to be the broader agricultural community's preference for how to respond to the Supreme Court decision ideally. We think the most effective and appropriate thing for the legislature to do is to affirm in statutory language the clear history of legislative intent, the history of statutory language which defines the exemption from municipal regulation as applying to all farms, that this exemption not be limited to issues related to water quality. Any suggested changes to municipal authority over farms could then be studied, such as what it would mean to not be able to functionally prohibit, as was asked before. To provide a little insight, in discussing this with our board after it first happened, shock was not only expressed by the farmers and the farm workers on the board, but also by Sarah Cattell, who was the former chair of the Senate Committee on Agriculture in Vermont. She served well before the RAPs were written into statute and can attest to the long history of how agriculture was statutorily made exempt from municipal regulation, how long the statute has been interpreted and applied this way. To address the Supreme Court ruling directly, which principally ruled based on statutory interpretation regarding how it referred to the RAPs, all you need to do is clarify in statute the municipal exemption that has always been intended by the legislature to apply to all farms. Potential impacts of the judicial changes, proposed legislative changes we're now discussing are unknown. They have not been given adequate time to be researched. So that would be our number one option. I just want to say, I've also heard folks make sort of light of the situation in Essex. I visited that site, and I think it's worth taking this a little more seriously. This man lost his livelihood when he was clearly following the law as it was intended and it had been interpreted for decades. We can feel how we do about the conflict and how it went, but hopefully we can agree that there shouldn't be room for bias in how someone in their business is treated due to personal conflict. And I'd also like to name that for this entire time, we have only heard a very, very limited number of examples of conflict locations in farms. And we absolutely support developing a statutory mechanism to deal with conflicts and limitations of the REPs and enforcement. And in fact, we are the only party here to have proposed such a solution. I think it's also been further implied here in discussion that the REPs are distinctly about regulating water quality. And I think for anybody who is familiar with how farms are regulated and what the REPs do, that is just not an appropriate interpretation. And if you want to invite in Laura DePietro or somebody else from the agency to explain that, it's going to be really helpful. So, as we've been told, this first solution is not politically feasible at this point. We have entered into sincere and earnest negotiations with the Agency of Agriculture and VLCT for months to arrive at some relatively common ground. I think, VLCT described some of those negotiations and some of the commonalities we found. Some of those were represented in the bill coming from House Agriculture prior to this proposed amendment. That bill focuses on the areas of greatest concern to VLCT, Tier 1 areas, acknowledging they would also like Tier 1B to be included, but that's where our agreement sort of falls apart. We'd like to see just Tier 1A and they'd like to see Tier 1B. It also limits the type of municipal oversight aspects of farming, the type of municipal oversight to aspects of farming relevant for municipality to have control over as relates to public safety. And Samantha explained a number of how that was iterated, both in their proposal, which was around like the church statute, as I call it, churches, hospitals, et cetera, and in ours, like specific enumerated abilities towns would have. And it does not make determinations over whether a farm should be regulated by any degree of municipal oversight based on an arbitrary number of acres a farm may or may not be, or whether a town should be able to limit the number of poultry on a farm based on an arbitrary number. So we're concerned that this proposal does not reflect the interests of any of the parties who have been negotiating for many months. It will not resolve the issues that have been discussed or which have surfaced at this time, and it moves substantially away from the work that was done in-house at Committee on Agriculture. Ultimately, we're curious to understand, and it was helpful to hear you say, Chair, at the beginning, where this draft came from. So we were a little, when it came up, we were like, well, these are interesting changes. This doesn't seem to align with some of the discussion we've heard. So just to go through our specific concerns, specifically addressing a farm must be 1 acre or larger to qualify for the exemption. So as has extensively been discussed, the size of a farm is not directly related to whether or how it impacts the community, the environment, et cetera, or how profitable or productive it is. 1 acre is not a number or threshold that has any evidence or reasoning associated with it from a perspective of discernible impact or risk. And rather, it creates a new barrier for small farms and less capitalized individuals and businesses to be starting, growing, and succeeding. Access to farmland is prohibitively expensive. People have access to the land they have access to. People living in more densely populated areas with access to fewer resources must have equitable access to growing an agricultural business and growing food year-round on the land they have access to. This does not meet the desires or concerns of VLCT or the Coalition of Agricultural Organizations. So based on our understanding, VLCT has stated, as have towns themselves and people working in municipal positions at towns, who are not speaking for the town when they talk to us, that towns do not want to have this responsibility to regulate all farms under 1 acre across the state. They do not feel like they have the capacity or expertise to do so. They only want to have regulatory authority in particular areas of the state where there's high traffic, high population density, and particular statutory encouragement. This is the Act 250 exempt and the incentives for high numbers of housing, et cetera, about how development is supposed to happen in these particular areas. So again, the VLCT has requested tiers 1A and 1B as those focus areas, whereas our coalition has put just tier 1A. Not only do towns not want this authority, but they have made it clear that they do not want unconditional authority, which this bill proposes, the amendment proposes. So VLCT has proposed municipalities have a limited type of regulatory authority, similar to how hospitals, churches, et cetera, are treated. And our coalition has articulated limited municipal authority that we would much prefer to this unconditional authority that's in this bill. None of us have advocated for unlimited municipal authority over any scale of farm or area in which farms are active. Providing municipalities unconditional zoning authority over farms less than 1 acre means that municipalities could choose to entirely disallow farms of this scales in parts of their towns, except as prohibited by the Right to Grow Food statute. If you were to look in Essex Junction at this moment, farming is prohibited in all areas except for planned agricultural areas where it's only a permitted use, which means you actually have to pay to get a permit and apply to be able to farm in that area. Nowhere else is farming permitted. This is not being asked for by the towns or VLCT or our coalition. It results in what we consider unreasonable potential prohibitions on people's right to produce food and the state's food security. As has been said by people who work in municipal town government themselves, they do not have the agricultural expertise. They do not have consistent regulators or regulations. They are far more prone to regulating based on bias versus clear and objective standards. We had a woman come in from Stratford who, speaking for herself, but who serves on the select board, who after learning about it, she came to testify against, basically to say, let's put this back how it used to be. We don't support including tier 1A or tier 1B. And they ended up voting down their tier 1B map when it came up because they said this map was drawn without understanding that we would be regulating agriculture in these areas. And this person said that they'd seen 7 new farms come up in their time on the select board there, that they see different members join the select board all the time who have different ideas about how people should or shouldn't be regulated or treated. I was just very concerned about how rollover on local town committees could affect how farms are regulated and the consistency or inconsistency of what people are facing. VLCT has also stated they are not only concerned about small farms, i.e. an acre or less, they are specifically concerned about high input and high output farms, in particular in these areas of higher population density and traffic. This amendment therefore would reduce the proposed authority towns could exert over all sizes and types of farms in the very areas where all parties can agree to limited municipal zoning oversight based on the nature of those areas. Lastly, the proposed amendment would also result in some farms far from village centers solely because of their size being subject to municipalities' regulations that are ostensibly meant to address issues within these village centers. I also want to point out there was no grandfathering of farms affected since this ruling in the bill. So farms have essentially been under a new legal landscape since the Supreme Court ruling, and some have been affected since this ruling based on the new authorities that have been provided. I feel it's critical for the legislature to provide a grandfathering clause in statute protecting any farm which may have been affected by municipal authority provided by the court ruling between when the court ruled and the passage of this bill. If the intent of the legislature is to address this court ruling, has dramatically changed the regulatory landscape for farms, we believe it is only equitable that we ensure that farms that have been affected due to the ruling be provided relief if they have been impacted by towns during the period of time between the ruling and the legislation impending at this time. I want to say, lastly, dealing with the problems, like as VLCT said, none of these solutions will necessarily effectively deal with all of the issues that have surfaced over time in these discussions, in particular related to livestock. And I believe Caroline was in here sometime in the last week or so presenting to you all specifically our proposal. Our coalition has proposed language which we have offered to this committee and others which would provide the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets greater discretion related to a number of animals on a particular parcel based on stocking density and allowing some discretion from the Secretary of Agriculture to make those decisions. So where they're saying we cannot respond to this issue given how the RAPs are written and the current enforcement discretion we have, we want to give them some discretion. We want to create that possibility. That is how we think we can most effectively address all these things. I want to say that we have recently received some analysis of undeveloped prime ag soils and potential tier 1B areas, but I have not come prepared to present on that at this time. We haven't done all of our assessment of it. And I haven't spoken to the poultry element as I was hoping that Caroline Gordon, who's our legislative director, would be able to come in and speak to it. She's also a beginning poultry farmer and can speak to some of the real issues with limiting to 15 and just thinking about it a little more in depth from an agricultural perspective. For example, if you're incubated chicks or chickens, you can actually have a very small effective business. You might just think about chickens as like large, full-grown animals living and pooping and creating eggs or being killed at some point. But there's lots of different ways people can raise chickens, and numbers and the size of animals might vary, and it might not actually be relevant to the impact those animals are having on neighbors or on the land itself. I think that might be all I have right now.
Thank you for your testimony. Carolyn just joined, but I don't know that we need a primer on chicken density at this time, but I'm glad you're able to join us. I guess the question I have for everyone is we have no tier 1A areas right now. And we may or may not get 1 or 10 or, so I guess I'm struggling with how this is hinged, what your preferred solution is hinged on something that is underway but doesn't exist yet. And I guess that's a question for the league, since this is mostly where you're coming down.
I guess I'd say two things. It goes to that question of, since none of them are actually in place, tier Bs are going to be rolling out. Tier 1B will be approved soon by the LURB, the first ones, which is a requirement before you become 1A. They're the same, that's the starting area first. Yes. And then the 1B has a separate application process. But that's the exact point. It gives time to maybe adopt model zoning before these new areas are actually in effect that municipalities can then regulate there.
I just want to be so with Act 181. So as Josh said, the 1B affirmation process is really what it is. Happens during the regional mapping, which is ongoing now. It started in December and is supposed to conclude December of this year. So in theory, by January 1, 2027, all of the regional maps will be approved and most of the tier 1B areas will have been both mapped and affirmed by the LURB at that point. And the process for applying for tier 1A status and going through that approval process before the LURB and the public is separate. And conceivably, there could be tier 1As. So the first region in line is Rutland. And I think conceivably, it's technically legal, under the law, it's technically possible that Rutland could have tier 1A approval for the city of Rutland before the end of this session or before the effective date of the miscellaneous ag bill or this bill. So if, assuming that would be in July or effective upon passage. The other potentially tier 1A eligible municipalities could come, 18 months after that. So the last region in line that would be getting, the maps would be getting approved next November, or this coming November, December, would be Two Rivers. So any tier 1A eligible municipalities in the Two Rivers region would be going before the LURB the first half of 2027. So that's the timeline under the current law.
Members have questions? Representative Levina.
Regarding the 1 acre, do you have any idea how many of your members would be affected who are smaller than 1 acre by this, one of these amendments here?
Graham Unix, Policy Director, Rural Vermont. We don't have a number. We've brought some people in to testify. We don't have a number. No, I think that's part of the reason, like when you ask about the study committee, and to us, it's a huge we thought the legislature might reconvene after the Supreme Court's decision was made last fall and just correct course. Just be like, we need to set this straight. And if people want to change this, let's study these things in the study committee. What would the solutions be? Who would they impact? We are clearly now, because we've been told there isn't the political will to do that, trying to like justify things and reason things without having the time to do really adequate research in it. I also opened it up to other members of the coalition, like NOFA Vermont isn't here, Maddie is here, and Caroline, you're also here now. And I don't want to be speaking, the only person for our coalition. There's probably 13 or 15 agricultural organizations in the coalition.
Sure, go ahead.
For the record, Maddie Kemner, Policy Director in Vermont. I think given the uncertainty and the timeline around the rollout of the tiers and the questions from this committee about whether that's an appropriate framing to use to solve this issue, I would just go back to Graham's original comments that I think the preference for our coalition would be passing the language that takes us back to clarifying legislative intent pre-Supreme Court decision, and then form a study committee to address like what would be in the league's testimony. They talked about the, a model zoning ordinance or a zoning bylaw that would adequately address these situations, especially pertaining to livestock. That doesn't exist, and this bill does not create model zoning in any of the iterations that we've seen. So a study committee, might be a good way to handle that working on a model ordinance. That was also more the tiers actually taking effect.
Where we are, but I really appreciate everyone coming in on Friday afternoon when there's a winter storm happening. We all are thinking about getting home safely. So to be continued. And I appreciate all of you joining us and providing.
Thank you.
Feedback. We're adjourned.